welcome to this conversation about the possibility of creating a Gaian constitution. We've had some talks about this in the context of this Archiarchy Makers Fair.
Yes.
And the fundamental idea is that a constitution is what defines our relation to law, to reality, what is sacred, what is important, and this idea of creating a Gaia constitution could pave the path to a completely different world. And this is what I would like to have a conversation about. Like, what are the important issues for really breaking free of the whole concept of the modern culture and into creating something completely new? And go.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues is realizing the evolution of cultures over time and how human beings came out of the trees a couple 100,000 years ago with essentially regarding planet Earth as a open 24-hour-a-day salad bar, provided by Gaia, by Mother Earth, hunters and gatherers and living in caves and things. So, and then only 10,000 years ago did the patriarchal game world start, the whole culture of having hierarchies and having borders and ownership and possessions and hierarchical domination, and then of course wars and battles, and that all happened, and it's like a teenage culture. So matriarchy culture is like a baby culture, and patriarchal culture is like a teenage culture, and cultures evolve, and it's time that humans evolve into the next culture, and there needs to be a framework for that, or a framework of understanding and clarity and support for our endeavors to try to work out who are we next as we grow up on planet Earth.
And an important dimension in this is to recognize also that all the concepts we have about law, about money, about social constructs, are basically inventions that human beings have made for various purposes. And because of that, we can remake them, we can reinvent them. And we're here at the Archiarchy Makers Fair, and so the archiarchy is a concept of what replaces matriarchy and patriarchy. And perhaps maybe you could just speak to that for a minute, to make it clear what it is.
Well, it's shocking actually for an individual, myself included, to realize the unsubstantial nature of what we consider to be the law or the reality of modern culture, the realities of modern economy and politics and even scientific proposals. And what we're faced with is taking responsibility for that. Having created it in the first place gives us, like you said, the power to recreate it. And this point of radical responsibility is the basis for the evolution of the next culture. Because a lot in the current patriarchal modern culture is designed around making profit by avoiding responsibility, externalizing costs and dumping your garbage in third world countries and just raping the earth with complete disregard for future generations, etc. And so this has become apparent more and more as people are able to feel and become conscious and more aware of what's really going on. And it's taken so many thousands, probably millions of people's efforts, step by step by step, to make that obvious, become more aware of what we've created for ourselves and the consequences of it that are turning out to be possibly terminal for life on Earth. And so the mandate for us taking responsibility for creating a Gaian constitution for our next steps as the culture evolves is, I can't imagine it having a higher pressure or higher immediate need than right now. And I've not heard of anyone else having this conversation. Even at the highest levels of the United Nations, they're still thinking it might be a good idea for people to do some inner development as part of their program right now, the inner development goals. And before that was their sustainable development goals, which is an amateur idea, thinking that what is happening can be sustained, but it cannot, because the systems as they're currently running are slamming us dead into a brick wall of physical reality in terms of using up resources, polluting everything. And it's really, the consequences have reached that high intensity level where it's important for us to have this kind of a conversation about, okay, we see where we are, we see where we've been, now we can start going, well, where could we go next? What's possible for us? And I really think this is an important conversation.
And if we look at the past, we can see that sort of great documents like the UN Charter, the United Nations Constitution, etc., they always grew out of a big conflict of some kind. And right now we are in a huge conflict about the nature of reality, about how to live on the earth without destroying it. I mean, there's a number of threats that could potentially be catastrophic within a fairly short time span. And so we can also see this as an opportunity. So, wow, okay, now there's an opportunity to actually reframe our entire reality, and also see that when we look at other constitutions, one really important element of that was to limit the power of the state or the king towards the subjects. And so this is also something that is on my mind, how a Gaian constitution would limit the power of the capital, of the kings, of the presidents, of the empires in relation to people, ecosystems, communities, and so on. And what's your thought on that?
I think it's important for us to remember that constitutions are a new development, only a few hundred years old in reality. And so we're amateurs at designing constitutions. And so we've made a first iteration that has resulted in, as you said, a power imbalance and the possibility of corruption, which is so easy for sociopathic and psychopathic personalities to climb to positions of power in hierarchy better than anyone else can. And the result being that global hierarchies are essentially topped with psychopaths around the world. And it's just this design error of the Constitution that we've been using. And to take responsibility for that is a radical move to actually face into, oh my God, we have designed our own demise, and it's a structural problem. One of the original statements in the Constitution of the United States of America is that, all men are created equal.
Yeah, all men.
Yes. And so that has not been actually, that was stated in a time when there was slavery. Slavery was common in those days. And so and women couldn't vote, et cetera, or own land. And so there's these huge distortions in what's written on a piece of paper and how you implement that. And one of those things that really intrigues me or sets itself on the central stage of this conversation has to do with this hierarchical structure of government and the corporate world, even the military and the religious world also. But a hierarchical structure is easily captivated by a personality trait that will do whatever it takes to take a position of power, to climb the ladder in the hierarchy. And that trait is now recognized as being sociopathic or psychopathic, which can be detected medically and identified. So it would be possible, for example, in this Constitution, to make it possible to forbid a psychopath from taking any position of power in any kind of a hierarchy. And so part of what's included in that entire process has to do with this distinction between being an adolescent and being an adult. And this whole process that was eliminated some 10,000 years ago from the modern culture about being able to have an authentic adulthood initiatory process that is not a simple ritual or ceremony, but it's actually a series of transformational processes that make a human being able to take a higher and higher levels of responsibility than they were before. And there's a gradation of how much responsibility a person can take. And so you go past child responsibility and adult responsibility, then you get into high and radical levels of responsibility. And the kind of culture that is emerging in our research that with the archiarchy, with the culture that comes after patriarchy and matriarchy, is that it's based on a central factor of radical responsibility, which brings about regenerative patterns rather than simply sustainable patterns. Because the basis of life on Earth is evolution, and the evolution of awareness, evolution of culture, evolution, and if you aim yourself at simply sustaining what exists already, you've annihilated evolution. You've annihilated that. And so in the center of archiarchy, which would be next culture, and would have a constitution that is essentially saying the center of it is authentic adulthood initiatory processes.
And that touches also upon a problem that I have encountered, at least in going into politics or wondering if I should go into politics, is that it's just like a soul-crushing machine the way it is today. I mean, it's so centered around manipulation of the media, about manipulation of the public to get elected, and I mean, there's so much going on which is out of integrity, and that most people who are in integrity have some kind of, or are not, have this sort of armor around them. They do not want to go there. And I sense that a lot with a lot of the people that I know in alternative movements. They say, well, I wish they would go into politics. And they're like, no, get me out of there. I don't want to touch that, you know. And I have the same thing, that I don't want to go into that machine. And so part of it, I think, also would be to design some kind of collective decision-making process that doesn't have that soul-crushing aspect to it.
If you must get the popular vote every 4 years, then you have a primary objective, which is to keep the population entertained or diverted. That's why I have a sense that it's a popular hobby or something to have wars and to keep people get distracted by the horrors and the consequences of having to face into thinking that another human being is my enemy, and it's either him or me, and then developing, an economy based on mass producing more and more destructive weapons, and that's the basis of an economy. I mean, I think an alien looking at our planet would really be disgusted. I think they'd be embarrassed and essentially block us from any kind of participation in an adult, kind of cultural collaboration anywhere. I mean, it's a bizarre idea, but the thing is, there's a certain level of disrespect for the honor that we've been given to be alive on planet Earth, that in terms of a planetary spirit that you might call Gaia would do an experiment giving a biological organism the capacity for self-will, for the ability to have will, and then see what happens. And the first thing humans have done is outlawed initiatory processes, banished the initiations, which actually brought us into adulthood. And to have that banished leaves the entire planet at risk. So it was a big risk that Gaia was taking to make human beings have this ability to choose something that could lead to their own demise. And she was taking a risk at this. And I think we've not actually respected the honor that we've been given with that.
And with bringing Gaia into the conversation, you're touching upon something which is really essential, I feel. And when I look out over the cultural landscape in the political world, there's not a single party or movement that has it as a clear distinction that Gaia is alive. And I think a lot of people in the alternative world, they are sort of really disgusted by democracy. Democracy is not working, etc. But what I'm seeing is also that there's really nothing worth voting for as like one problem. And so there's two things to this. One is this need of bringing this distinction in clearly that we are inhabiting a living being, and there's this whole evolution going on. And the other question is, if it would be possible, if people were given an alternative, like a vision of the Constitution, if it might be possible that people would actually use their vote for say, yes, this is the reality we want, and that we, through democratic means, could reframe our entire way of viewing this problem. And so in the future, like going from the feudal to democracy, which was a big step, now from democracy to archiarchy or Taurus technology, or whatever the name is of a new thing which does not have all these problems built into it.
When I look around at all the countries, the 195 or 4 nations that are incorporated in the United Nations ruling, and I'm looking at their constitutions, and I'm going, is there any constitution that would inspire me to a bright future for humanity, that leads a path away from our kind of doomed horizon right now and into something? And I see nothing. And I think basically most people are not inspired by that. But who's brave enough to stand up and say that? Who's standing up? It's time to start over. It's time to give ourselves another chance and take responsibility for what we've created, and with the same power we use to create that, create the next thing, our next experiment, and write quickly, I would say. And so I think that this consideration needs to spread around, mature, develop quite quickly for us to take action in short enough time span that it makes a difference for us.
Hold on, let me just give a moment for the people who are speaking downstairs.
Is it still running?
It is.
Yeah. Are there something issues you would like us to get into that I should ask to? What's on your mind and your heart?
Well, the process of writing a constitution has been typically occurs with a few people sitting down and going into a certain space, creation space, and collecting up the wits and the intelligence of the entire culture, the entire population around it, kind of bringing it to the table and then formulating it into a constitution that would resonate with people's hearts and souls. And there are certain people who can do that kind of work and many who cannot. And so I don't think it's going to be much of a process of consensus decision making. It isn't going to be like that. Many decisions in the United Nations, for example, are vetoed by Russia, China, and America, who are the ones who are most wildly rogue nations and out of control in terms of a future for humanity on Earth. And so somehow this question of authoring the Constitution and then ratifying it, and ratification of a Constitution at this point is going to be, it's going to feel like Dad comes home and goes, "You have made a mess of planet Earth. Go to your room. Mm-hmm. Clean up your mess." Because right now there's no dad. There's no space holder for the out of control, thoughtless, irresponsible, inconsequent thinking. You know, it's like there's nobody putting the consequences in our face and delivering consequences of irresponsibility and mess making. So that would be part of the ratification of the Constitution is if you want to live on planet Earth, here's the game world, here's how it goes. It's a planet, it's a closed ecology. There's no off. You can't throw stuff off the planet. There's no way to throw things away. Everything goes to everything else. And essentially, if you make garbage that you can't eat, you're killing your children. So that's what we've been doing. And there's a certain value system, I think, that can be talked about in terms of a material value system compared to what is almost inconceivable right now, which is it's a non-material value system. What to value that's non-material. And so, for example, this conversation that we're having is non-material. It's being brought together and invented right here in this space. And yes, there is equipment being used that's useful for recording and sharing the conversation. At the same time, that can happen in another way. That can happen other ways. So it's not being, the non-material value of this conversation is not limited by the technology. It's not even being created by the technology. It's being created by inventive consciousness and awareness of necessity. And so the non-material value economics and the whole value system of non-material value is a whole part that I think is emerging right now around the world in many, many corners. There was a book written around the year 2000 called about the cultural creatives, Ray Anderson and Sherry, don't remember her name. And that was 25 years ago when they assessed how many cultural creatives there are on planet Earth. And I think that's multiplied by tenfold by now. And because everywhere I look, there are people feeling the dire necessity and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps in ways that we can't even imagine, and calling forth human creativity that's astonishing at its intensity and productivity, like its ability to reproduce itself. And there are more and more conferences that are unconferences forming, where people are actually coming together with no guest speakers or no program of entertainment, and what they're coming together to do is connect and collaborate, connect and co-create, and this is where the intelligence spreads around and gets created. And so I'm so enthusiastic about that happening, and this conversation about what kind of a constitution would bring human soul to life, human spirit to life, rather than out of in a survival modality.
And I mean, if you look around, stress and depression, and I mean, it's clear that there is a deep need for nurturing other aspects of our being, and this ties closely into the non-material value you're talking about. And at the other side, there's this question of what kind of material life will be possible in a sustainable world. I mean, do we have to go back to scrapping all cars and airplanes, or can we have a world based on maybe fusion energy that allows us to use these things? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how in a world ruled by a non-material value system that sort of prioritizes that which nourishes the soul over that which fills the bank, how does the material aspect of society look in your estimation?
Yeah, you're pointing at a question which most people don't want to look at, called population and growing population. And because a growing population on a limited planet is a doomed future. So without bringing into focus the 8 billion mouths that we're trying to feed, or 8 billion Mercedes-Benzes we're trying to put in people's garages, et cetera, is a fantasy world, some kind of foolhardy oversight of crucial factor of what's going on. It's like, I don't know how many people you know, but how many people do you need on a planet? What's the optimum number of people to being on a planet? And it would be something that would be sustainable, regenerative on the planet itself, that the carrying capacity of the Earth is known. And we've exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth quite a while ago. And it's like, okay, why are we doing this? Are we just as stupid as bacteria, just dying in our own waste because we just overpopulate?
Well, I think the answer to the ask must be yes. I mean, basically, all species have this tendency to reproduce until they reach an unsustainable level and then either collapse or decline, depending on the circumstances.
When they're not conscious of those things.
Yeah.
And we are, theoretically, conscious of those things.
Theoretically.
And so we have the option of choosing something different.
But we're not acting according to it. So, but if we started acting according to that, there would be, and I don't think it's, I wouldn't have an answer for that. How many is, but is possible. But there's something about the way we produce and use. I mean, it would be possible to create an economy that was circular, and then I think the limiting factor would actually be energy in the end. If you have the energy to sustain different types of culture, but I mean, there's so many levels in this. It's a very difficult conversation. So I think my thinking about that has been to try to create experiments, to create meaningful regions of human endeavor with enough people that it's not that there are a meaningful breadth of activities going on, so that it sort of simulates the whole to some extent, like a small country or something like that, and create a number of different experiments with what will it actually take to create a sustainable culture, and at what level of complexity and comfort is it possible to sustain civilization while keeping within planetary bounds. So I think experimentation is at least one of my go-to solutions.
I appreciate that, and I'm glad about that, being an experimenter myself. What I've found so far is that human beings easily are subsumed by fantasies that they can understand. So for example, in the Star Wars universe, you can imagine a planet with no trees, or a city with no trees, or certain amounts, having a starship that will go faster than the speed of light. You just hop in and jet to a new planet, and it just is only a matter of energy. You just need some of that blue stuff that comes out in Hollywood, and you can do kind of almost anything. And it's something that we can imagine as being true, and I think it's so far away from reality that, for example, in the Biosphere 2 experiment done in Tucson, Arizona, where something like 8 people tried to live for 2 years inside of a greenhouse, and what they encountered in terms of the actual feedback mechanisms of their living environment, just essentially almost killing them. And this is the brightest people on the planet designing that environment, and we're so far away from living in a world without a planet, an organic planetary basis, that thinking that power is enough to solve the problem. I mean, just the thermodynamic problem of getting rid of enough heat off of planet Earth is been calculated last century. It's really a problem to get, and it's proving to be true with the greenhouse gases that are building up so quickly, with methane more than 2,000 parts per billion on the planet, and it's essentially capturing so much heat, and we're not even hardly generating the kind of heat you're talking about from the energy use.
Well, I mean, I didn't mean to imply that energy was the only thing. I would just say that energy is a thing. I mean, we have probably at peak oil if we haven't passed it, and even things like wind and solar very much depend on fossil fuel to create them. So there is like an energy death possible if we don't find other resources, and nuclear energy as it is a big problem. But I don't know if I really want to get into the weeds about this energy problem, because I think that the way I see it, there are so many things that need to be figured out, and so many complexities on the path there, and so much resistance to it, that a thing that would be possible, I think, would be for people that really have in their heart to create a different planet, to get together and start by looking at what do they actually agree upon, and start with that, and start with the sort of the big changes that needs to happen, and then find out, and how does all these other things go with time because there's so many things we don't know, and new technologies also pop up all the time.
Yeah, your question of, let's start out with what we agree upon. Essentially, I would say it's nothing. We don't agree upon anything.
Even you and I?
For example. And
I hope we agree on it.
And to wrap it up, it's like, I think that's the crux of the matter, is how do human beings interact in more effective ways? And I think that's where I've been experimenting the last 45 years in that domain, and been, I say, rather successful. And there's so much to learn still, but we've learned so much already. And the experiments, like you said, are central to that. So I think we agree on the necessity for experiments.
Well, that's one thing.
It's a big thing.
It's a big thing. All right.
Thank you.